Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Bolshevism, its roots, class view, and methods by Rudolf Sprenger, whose real name was Helmut Wagner. This is like a council communist critique of Bolshevism and the Soviet Union. This chapter is titled A Bourgeois Revolutionary Movement. Insofar as they were composed of intellectuals, the Russian Social Democrats did not differ from the old Narodniki or the Social Revolutionaries. In view of the bitter opposition that existed between the Social Democrats and the Social Revolutionaries, neither of these trends could be talked of as the direct extension of the older revolutionary movement of the Russian intelligentsia. The Social Revolutionaries could say about themselves that the Social Revolutionaries had taken over the methods of struggle, the conceptions of development, and the peasant perspective of the populace, the Narodniki, On the other hand, the early Social Democrats, as Marxists, fought against the Narodniki, and the Bolsheviki felt that they were the guardians and renovators of the original Marxist theory. They referred to their own ideology as the finally perfected and developed form of Marxism. They described themselves as the only genuine heirs of Marx and Engels. If these claims were well grounded, the Bolshevik Party was the direct and sole continuator of the political and theoretic movement that has its starting point in the work of the two founders of scientific socialism. Could Bolshevism really lay claim to this role? The question is of great significance to the workers of the world. It can only be answered by clearing up another matter. Quote, to what extent was the social character of Bolshevism determined by Bolshevism's origin in the revolutionary intelligentsia of Russia? Was Bolshevism the continuation of the international Marxist movement of the working class, or was Bolshevism merely the continuation of a national Russian movement of the revolutionary intellectuals of that country? End quote. Bolshevism will contest the right even to pose such a question. Bolshevism will point to Bolshevism's Marxist orthodoxy, but the social significance of a revolutionary movement does not depend merely on that revolutionary movement's ideology. The social significance of a revolutionary movement depends on the social content hiding behind this ideology. The essential marks of Bolshevism are not Bolshevism's Marxist formulas. The essential marks of Bolshevism are the social facts found behind and near Bolshevism's principles, and the policies springing from those social facts. Only if the principles and the given social facts agree can the Bolsheviks' claim to a position at the peak of the development of Marxism be justified. The old Narodniki movement ended in a blind alley. The old Narodniki movement's terrorist wing, Narodная Volya, was destroyed without succeeding in releasing a peasant revolt. When its propagandist wing, the Cherny Paradiel, appeared on the scene and experienced the bankruptcy of its program of, quote, going to the people, end quote, the peasants were unaffected by its propaganda. As a result, a section of the populist intelligentsia began to revise their tactics. The Russian revolutionists knew that, as intellectuals, they could not themselves start and carry through a revolution. They felt themselves to be no more than the predestined guides and inspirers of a revolt, in which they would have the function of expressing the aim of the struggle and occupying the positions of command. They considered themselves to be the general staff of the Russian Revolution, the regiments of which would be composed of the broad popular masses. By, quote, going to the people, end quote, they were going to enlist and organize these regiments. This outlook had already been developed in great detail by Bakunin, whose disciples helped to form the first ranks of the Narodnik movement. Bakunin did not consider it important to educate the people for revolution. Bakunin thought that, quote, stirring up, end quote, the peasant masses was enough to win the peasant masses over to a revolutionary offensive. Up to then, the same masses had rebelled badly and unsuccessfully. It was necessary, said Bakunin, to bring order, plan, organization to the otherwise disorganized rebellion. This was the task of quote, devoted, energetic, intellectual personalities, end quote, who had to be, quote, genuine friends of the people, end quote, and, quote, individuals with the devil in them, end quote. By their boldness, these persons were to lead the people in action and serve as, quote, intermediaries between the revolutionary idea and the people, end quote. These born revolutionists, so to say, quote, we're not going to compose the army of the revolution. The people itself must make up the revolutionary army. The revolutionary intellectuals could act as a sort of general staff, end quote. The, quote, commanding staff, end quote, of the revolution would emerge from the, quote, educated world of the bold youth, end quote, that is, from among the daring students. Under this staff, Bakunin wanted to organize the masses, quote, the laboring people are numerous, but the mass means nothing if it is not organized, end quote, Bakunin wrote. In 1869, the Bakuninists, under the leadership of Nechayev, drafted a general and very definite plan for an uprising. First, circles of revolutionary students were to be built, thus creating an officer corps. Then the revolutionists were going to turn to the, quote, have-nots, end quote, of Russian society, to the declassed elements of the cities and provincial towns, and send them, in the capacity of, quote, propagandists of the deed, end quote, into the villages. The expectation was that early in 1870, a general mass revolt would break forth, bringing destruction to Tsarism and liberty to the people. By the, quote, people, end quote, the Bakuninists and the Narodniki meant the peasants. They saw no other army for the revolution. Already in 1851, Alexander Herzen prophesied, quote, should autocracy triumph over civilization, a peasant revolt, a colossal insurrection, would unroll before its eyes, end quote. He explained that in Russia the music, which is like peasant, would be the personage of the future, just as in France the worker. Herzen thus gave expression to the basic dogma of the Narodnik kind of socialism. Quote, in Russia there is no capitalist development, therefore the Russian socialist movement must spring directly from the peasantry, which is uninfluenced either by the high development or decomposition of Western civilization, end quote. The social democratic intellectuals drew new conclusions from the old reliance of the Narodniki on a typically Russian, quote, revolutionary army, end quote. The Narodniki saw only the peasants, and they exhausted themselves in fruitless attempts to revolutionize the peasants. In the end, they found themselves alone. The passivity of the peasant masses seemed unconquerable. The result of the terrorist duel with Tsarism proved that a struggle limited to a handful of intellectuals was impossible. The intelligentsia could lead a revolution, but could not make it. If the revolution did not find support in the peasantry, the intellectuals had to turn perforce to the workers, who then began to bestir themselves in strike activity. The social democratic intellectuals caught sight of the growing contingent of Russian workers, who up to then struggling independently. The social democratic intellectuals started to make efforts to win a mass following for themselves in the new field. Axelrod wrote in the Iskra of 1903, quote, in order to arouse the masses out of their historic sleep, in order to lead the masses into the political arena, it was necessary to encourage in the masses a systematically revolutionary outlook and activity. It was especially necessary to encourage their understanding of their own difficult conditions and its causes. The solution of this historic task was attempted in its way by the, quote, Narodnik, end quote, movement in the 70s of the past century. That movement did not succeed in solving this task because it did not recognize the historic significance of the class of industrial workers, a class that was entirely new in the Russia of that day. Only Marxism could find the key. Only Marxism could show the means and the way to the solution of the basic, generally democratic problems of the Russian revolutionary movement. Here lies the root of the strength of our party, the reason for its final victory over all other revolutionary factions, and its present unshakable position, end quote. In other words, the class movement of the Russian proletariat was to be subordinated to the Russian intelligentsia. Nachimson, referring to the proletarian strike movement of his time in his comment on Pashchinov's The Condition of the Working Class in Russia, wrote, quote, "For the democratic intelligentsia, these strikes were especially important because since 1896 it sought to reach the proletariat, having recognized in the workers a stronger fighter against Tsarism." End quote. An idea similar to Axelrod's was expressed by Cherevyanin in his pamphlet The Proletariat and the Russian Revolution. Finally, the delegation of the Russian Social Democracy declared in its report to the International Socialist Congress in 1904, quote, ... The Russian Social Democracy came into being primarily as an organization of revolutionary intellectuals who were disappointed with the previous methods used in their fight for liberty, and who arrived at the understanding that, in the capitalistically developed Russia, only the proletariat could offer them a sure support in their struggle against Tsarism. End quote. The Russian Social Democracy discovered the proletariat as the only mass force of the Russian Revolution that was capable of action. The Russian Social Democracy discovered the proletariat as the only force of the Russian Revolution that was capable of action. The change that came with this discovery was unprecedented in Russia. As a result, the beached anti-Tsarist movement could again be set in motion. As a result, the beached anti-Tsarist movement could again be set in motion. But as long as the turn did not mean the abandonment either in theory or practice of the old Bakuninist Narodnik thesis of a general staff formed of intellectuals commanding a people's revolutionary army subjected to that general staff, it was merely a tactical turn. Anything else was impossible as long as the revolutionary intelligentsia were the commanding staff of the social democratic circles. And at the time of the formation of the Russian Social Democracy, there was hardly a suspicion of the decisive character of this question. The Social Democrats asserted that it was necessary and unavoidable for the, quote, revolutionaries, end quote, to win the peasant and proletarian masses, which were to be led into revolution by the, quote, revolutionaries, end quote. Therefore, they made no fundamental differentiation between activity among the peasants and among the workers. Plekhanov, for example, wrote in 1884 in his book Our Differences of Opinion, which marks Plekhanov's complete transition to the social democratic ideology, that the antagonisms between the propagandists working in the villages and the terrorists active in the cities could be overcome precisely through the formation of a, quote, labor party, end quote. The strife between the village and the city revolutionists would disappear as the political struggle in the cities took on a worker character. Then the two groups would differ only according to their place of activity and not according to the nature of their activity. They would be two representative forms of one popular movement. The formation of a, quote, labor party, end quote, was expected to bring political strength to the intelligentsia and move them in one line. According to this line, the work among the city proletariat would be no more than a branch of the general movement. The representation, the leadership of this movement was to remain the task of the intellectuals, who also, in Plekhanov's original conception, were going to compose the commanding staff of the revolution. Axelrod expressed the same idea in his discussion of the political tasks of the Russian intelligentsia in the Neue Zeit of 1898. He declared that, quote, the ideological elements of our upper classes, end quote, could not stop at mere propaganda activity, but had to direct the amused revolutionary energies of the, quote, popular masses, end quote, toward political action. Quote, predestined, so to speak, for this historic task are the proletarianized strata of the intelligentsia, the student youth, as well as the great majority of the spirited and democratic representatives of our intelligent citizenry, end quote. He stressed the leadership of the popular masses by the intellectuals, and presented at the same time the significance of the proletariat for the purposes of the intelligentsia. Quote, naked reality points for the revolutionary intellectuals to the industrial proletariat as the class in which the organization of a revolutionary people's movement has the best chance of success, end quote. Axelrod. Lenin also, in his 1897 treatise on the task of the Russian social democracy, placed the proletariat in a central position only, quote, because the latter shows the greatest susceptibility to social democratic ideas, the highest intellectual and political maturity, and thanks to its numbers and concentration in the larger focal centers of our country, decides the outcome of the battle, end quote. At the same time, Lenin explained that the social democracy had to support the propaganda activities of other forces in the villages, since it could not, by reason of its numerical weakness, undertake this itself. The social democratic circles continued the old going to the people. The social democratic circles continued the old going to the people. But the social democratic circles turned mostly to the workers instead of the peasants. The social democratic circle's activity was, more than anything else, the contemporary continuation of the work of the Narodniki. The Marxist theory adopted by them was nothing more than an ideological guard for this task, a covering that helped to tie the revolutionary intelligentsia over a period that they themselves could not cope with. Otherwise, the Russian social democracy, and especially Bolshevism, moved straight along the political lines set by the Narodnik movement. New section. The organizational prototype of Bolshevism. The idea of the Revolutionary General Staff was first expressed by Bakunin, who should be described by Lenin's disciples as the, quote, grandfather of Bolshevism, end quote. Pokrovsky remarks in his History of Russia, quote, certain features of revolutionary organization, which later found a definite form in the Bolshevik Party, were already noticeable in the 60s, when we can already observe the conspiratorial relationship, the systematic program of activity, and the choice of intersection as a method of action, end quote. Pokrovsky considers as especially Bolshevik Nechaev's scheme of insurrection, which is going to be realized with the aid of a strictly professional revolutionary organization. Pokrovsky writes that in the Russian revolutionary circles of the 60s, there's formulated a plan, quote, later derided by the Mensheviki, but which was actually applied on November 7th, 1917. It was literally the plan of the finally realized revolution, end quote. Pokrovsky. Such a centralized conspiratorial organization was, however, never attained by the Bakuninists. Supporting himself on the moralistic injunction found in Bakunin's Revolutionary Catechism, Nechaev juggled before his master and his comrades the blueprint of a non-existent organization. The Narodniki were, in fact, the first to apply Bakunin's plan, but 10 years before the birth of the populist terrorist organization, Bakunin formulated the viewpoint calling for the total subordination of the revolutionaries to the central leadership of their party. In the Oath of the Active Brothers of his secret alliance, we read, quote, Bakunin's secret alliance, we read, quote, I swear by my honor and life that I agree fully with all the philosophic, economic, and social, theoretic, and practical principles of your revolutionary catechism. I submit myself without exception to all the orders contained in your manual of regulations. I reserve my duty and right to oppose in discussion at the next assembly all secondary points on which I may hold a different opinion, but I accept beforehand the definite and supreme decision of the organization. From now on, I subordinate my entire activity, public and private, political, professional, and social, to the supreme guidance I shall receive from the councils of this society, end quote. At first, such, quote, Bolshevist, end quote, ideas of discipline had as little influence on the political movement of the Russian intelligentsia as the injunctions of absolute scrupulousness contained in Bakunin's, quote, Revolutionary Catechism, end quote. The radical intellectuals turned to the ideas of Lavrov, who proposed peaceful propaganda, but soon Tkachev arose to oppose Lavrov with Jacobinical and Blancist projects. The state power was to be seized by a determined revolutionary minority. To attain this aim, this revolutionary minority was going to organize itself illegally, subjecting its members to strict discipline without initiating all of them in the secrets of the organization. After such preparation, the organization would finally set loose a general terror. For Tkachev, the revolutionary intelligentsia played a decisive role. Quote, "Neither now nor in the future is the people left to itself, capable of accomplishing the social revolution. Only we, the revolutionary minority, can and must accomplish the revolution, and as soon as possible, ... The people cannot help itself. The people cannot direct its own fate to suit its true needs. It cannot give body and life to the ideas of the social revolution ... This role and mission belong unquestionably to the revolutionary minority." End quote. Tkachev. The position presented by Tkachev was going to serve as a guideline for the Narodniki terrorists and after them the Bolsheviki. It did not find an immediate echo in Lavrov's propagandist circles. At that moment, Mikhailov and Nathanson were organizing the, quote, "going to the people," end quote. But the repressive measures of the Tsarist government drove the revolutionaries to terrorism. After a few years, Tkachev's ideas were translated into action. A terrorist executive committee was formed in the spring of 1879. This terrorist executive committee consisted of adherents of several revolutionary bodies. The latter were organized in three circles, one concentrically opening into the other. The innermost circle formed the executive committee. It drew its co-workers out of the lower bodies. Only individuals who were in the position to participate directly in this revolutionary work were taken into this conspiratorial scheme. The activity of the executive committee led the following winter to the formation of the People's Will Party, Narodnaya Volya. So, Narodnaya Volya, in parentheses. Shelyabov, who had worked in the old executive committees, was the head of the new organization. Members were recruited by the individual circles. The executive committee was chosen by a free vote of its membership and the representatives of the lower groups. The latter had in their province the general work of preparing for the uprising, such as propaganda for a constitutive assembly, drafting demands in behalf of the peasants and raising funds. Special groups took charge of propaganda in the army. Among the students and workers, ran presses, organized the sale of newspapers and the placing of bombs. Each body remained independent in its particular branch of activity. However, the executive committee gave, quote, "political leadership," end quote, to the total organization. It controlled the executive of the entire revolutionary program, regulated connections among the various groups, and issued the party press. In its hands was concentrated the armed struggle against the government. Under its immediate command stood the combatant hands, each consisting of about 10 men, and formed independently of other sections of the total organization. In the execution of its particular task, each terrorist band acted independently. It was formed and recruited by its own vote. However, the executive committee could veto the admission of any candidate. Once a terrorist band was in action, it chose a leader, who then received dictatorial powers of command. This was the organization of the terrorist Narodniki. Their executive committee and combatant groups were classic organisms of professional revolutionaries, requiring from their members complete devotion to their revolutionary work, renunciation of their civil activity and private life, and submission to an iron discipline. The organization of the terrorist Narodniki was quite suited to their political aim. The People's Will Party consisted of about 500 members. Around them gathered several thousand sympathizers. The terrorist bands themselves were limited to several dozen individuals. During the 3 years of their activity, the terrorist Narodniki executed 6 attempts on the lives of very high officials and 4 attempts on the lives of chiefs of police. They also carried out the death sentence imposed by their executive committee on Tsar Alexander II. Besides, 9 spies and traitors were put to death. The Bolsheviki liked to attach themselves historically to the prototype offered by the organization of the terrorist Narodniki. They recognized in it all the features they considered essential in their own organization: the total power of the central leadership, the professional revolutionary composition, absolute centralization, military discipline. If in spite of their meager forces, the Narodnik terrorists could accomplish a great deal of by means of this organizational principle, what could be done by an organization that was much larger and hoped to find support in the mass of the proletariat! Why that way Russia could really be, quote, taken off its hinges, end quote. Lenin wanted an organization that would unite in itself, quote, socialist science and the revolutionary experience that the lessons of many decades have instilled in the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia, end quote. By uniting the formal principle of, quote, democratic centralism, end quote, with the Narodnik principle of a professional revolutionary organization, the Bolsheviki created their particular, typically Russian type of political organism. Thanks for listening. That was chapter 2 of Helmut Wagner's essay, Bolshevism, Its Roots, Role, Class View, and Methods. Thanks for listening. Next is chapter 3, which is titled The Political Line of Descent.